Thank you, Manuela, for this really kind presentation. Thank you all for bearing with me. It's very late. I'm the last one to speak, and we are moving from from disease and biochemistry to Bologna in the 14th century. So I would just first thanks to the very supportive team of Le Studium for welcoming so well their researchers and enabling us to step out of our comfort zones in many ways, and a special thanks to the tour team, and for instance for people who were not mentioned, Maureen, who was very helpful in organizing the conference I did at the Palais de Justice de Tours, Clément, who dealt with our fiscal taxes, which is a nightmare, and of course everyone here present today. So yesterday, Serge Grouard mentioned in passing that Georges Bataille once lived in the Hôtel du Panloup when he was a librarian at the Bibliothèque Municipale d'Orléans, which was just below. In 1925, he received, Georges Bataille, a photograph depicting a torture method formerly practiced in China, the death by 1,000 cuts. What I'm going to, so it's the torture of the Lingxi. What I'm going to present here is something very different, rooted in the Christian context, and probably something that will maybe be understood for our European standards. So I will speak about the rituals linked to the Christian roots of early modern societies, and especially the history of punishment and execution. So this history is more than a history of laws and action. It is also a history of representations and visualities, including, and that's probably the most imaginative thing I want to propose today, including what could be imagined as well and what could be seen. So in the Museum of Fine Arts in Tours, you have to bear in mind those tavolette you see here in an enormous format are about that size. And they were held on a handle, and they were held by the comforters, and they would accompany the condemned to the scaffold. So it's an object, and I'm going to look at this visuality, but also this materiality. I wish to reflect on a special type of paintings which were used during the public staging of capital punishment in the late medieval and early modern world. So these tavolette come from Bologna. Beyond the usual canons of art history, I wish to understand how people perceive these objects, interpreted what they see, and more importantly, how art and law were combined in a particularly compelling way. In those days, judicial officers would also perform trials by ordeal. They would take animals to courts, and they would have brutal shaming practices. So I hope that the case I will show today, paradoxical and scaring as it is, can be a useful expression of a very pressing problem. The issue is whether or not an image can play a narcotic-salvific role in the staging of decapitation. So these types of paintings are usually not well known. The problems these artifacts pose are rarely addressed by art historians. They are not known by lawyers most of the time, because they mainly keep to the description of styles and schools, and they rarely question visual dispositives through the approach of cognitive sciences. So in my examination of these panels, I wish to arouse a cross-disciplinary conversation on what might comprise an adequate understanding of these tools for dying well, what does it mean, dying well? As I believe that cognitive sciences may help us to define the processes involved by the manipulation of these images. So I will first need to explain the historical medieval background in which these images are displayed. I will then turn to some of the hypotheses I want to discuss with you. So the underlying assumption might be something like this: our sense of punishment, both individually and collectively, is made and remade through the visual. And therefore, it is fundamentally important to learn how to see them as images in action. So throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern period, but you have also survivors in the 19th century penal system. I've seen that in some cultures. Mobile images, so these are tavolette, little tavolet, but also crucifix, were used to accompany the condemned to their execution sites, where scaffolds were set, usually outside the town, extramuros. In Bologna and other northern Italian towns, criminals carried right before their face tavolette, and these were usually mobile representations of Christ's passions or saints' martyrdoms. And they were used, so as the text say, as dying heads to guide the soul of the executed through redemption. So the narcotic-salvific icon of Christ on the cross would appear either on little portable panels or in the shape of mobile crucifixes, held at, that's very important, at the level of the eyes of the condemned. And sometimes you find examples where they had also sides just for the condemned to not be spat on or not be diverted. The Musée des Beaux-Arts de Tours contains a very rare example of these panels, so my talk will be dedicated to this case study. So I'm going to start with this rediscovery of judicial tavolette. So since the 1980s, a revival of visual studies combined with a new awareness of the uses of judicial images has brought to the fore a number of issues pushing the conceptualization of the anthropology of judicial images. So these mobile paintings were designed as to show icons of death, suffering, horror, or martyrdom. Their role as visual dying head is not easy to analyze. Somewhere between devotional tools, because we know that, for instance, Bernardino da Siena used tavolette to convert and in a devotional context. So they were also manipulated by lay brothers on the very site of the scaffold before the criminal was put to death and executed by the boot. However, horrifying it is, inflicting death was subjected to a highly ritualized performance, and these small panels served as stimulator of guilt and penitence. The main scope was to avoid what they called assidia, or even the escape of the prisoners, because sometimes the staging of capital punishment would be very in danger. So on the several essays, notably Jérôme Bachet, but also Adriano Prosperi, Il sangue e l'anima, Christine Clapis-Joubert, Le voleur de paradis, Le bon larron, etc., have studied this role played by the work of the confortatori. So in Bologna and other north and central Italian towns, special lay confraternities were dedicated to the spiritual comfort of condemned criminals. So they carried those mobile images which depicted Christ's martyrdoms generally, or the suffering of the saints. And before execution, during a whole night of prayer, they would show those panels in a very sort of dramatic preparation to death. These texts now, the text out of the instructions from Bologna comforters were actually, they are now edited, and what was really interesting is those texts are very precise. They are handbooks dedicated to the art of executing well. So I will read here a depiction of the ritual so that you can imagine what happened. So when you are at the block and he who has to die kneels down to put his head on it, you kneel down as well, using your right knee and keeping the tavoletta in such a way that he always has his eye on it. That is, so he always sees it. And sincerely, this is really important, tell him the following words. My dearest brother, make yourself strong and steady at this step and don't have fear. And aim to offer your soul clean and devout to the Creator who gave it to you. And similarly, pay attention to when the executioner lifts the mallet. Make sure that you never move the tavoletta under the criminal's face until the mallet is close to the chopping block. And make sure that you pull the tablet away at the same time as a blow, etc. So you see here the description, the technology of death with this most brutal instruction. So the comforters, this manual of Bologna's Company of Death, dating back to the 15th century, shows how very precisely these tavolette were used as visual dying aids. Mobile crucifixes were traditionally, that's the idea that the painted panel was supposed to stay before the prisoner's face until the final delivery of the coup de grâce at the scaffold would happen. And the idea was that this icon of spiritual salvation, the suffering of Christ, because Christ, of course, is innocent, or the martyrdom of a saint, was to be substituted by the instrument of divine justice and bodily destruction. Here you see a tavoletta here in the hand of condemned to be executed, and that's Jos de Damuder, the Praxis Rerum Criminalium, which is a very interesting practical and illustrated book showing penal executions. So these example drawn from Damuder illustrated treatise of penal law shows that these practices were widely disseminated, not only in Italy, you had them in the Flanders, and you also had them in Germany with various differences. In Renaissance Italy, new types of visual dying aids were invented. So that I was alluding to those mobile tavolette with blinkers. So those blinkers, which made it virtually impossible for the poor sinner to concentrate on anything else but the holy image in front of him. In one passage of the comforting manuals, like that of the Bologna's Compagnia di Santa Maria della Morte, the lay brother is exhorted to, I quote, make sure that the poor foe looks him in the eye and at the tablet so that he does not look around. So you see the painted panel was supposed to stay before the prisoner's face until the very end, and this the repetition of the rite indicates, in fact, a double process. If the preacher wants to convince visually the poor foe that he must now focus anew in order to separate his earthly existence from the advent of his new life, whether in paradise or hell, after his death, he needs to reveal the extreme overlapping of his fate with the Christ's martyrdom. So he has to imagine he is sort of a brother of Christ himself, just to maybe accept his fate. This is something that is in the theory of the manual of the comforters, obviously, but you can well imagine it not quite clearly worked like that most of the time. Because the comforter and the boot needs the condemned to nod in the direction of something beyond death, where devilish acts become more devilish, so he has to have fear, but also where good actions might lead to salvation. So that's the sort of ideal working process that they were looking at. So the logic of this type of penal theory and ritual practice was carefully delineated. The poor sinner had to be severed from the spectators who mocked him or cheered him, from mouth spitting on him or furious gestures against him, if you think of what Michel Foucault clearly showed. But the main argument for what we call an obstinate visual diversion was the belief that the prisoner, before his execution, had entered the fiercest battle of his life, because he was now facing the devil, and the devil would tempt him to despair, and so he had to prepare his redemption, and also we had to avoid the idea that he would the fit of panic and anticipate the coming pain. So here you see other condemns with crucifixes. So that's the other type of visual material dying heads, because actually what I've been able to show is that those objects were also kissed by the condemned. They were not only seen, they were also kissed, and I'll show you the... So here we have the case I analyzed thanks to my Studium fellowship, and we have been able to deframe the tavolette, because as you can see, the last owner of these panels had absolutely no clue what they were used for, and he just transformed them into devotional little paintings, and he had no idea. So he was himself a painter, Octave Linné, and so he also corrected the gory details he didn't want to see, because he wanted a nice pendant of the Virgin in the mandola. So you see here the condemned kneeling in front of the mandola. So my assumption is this tavolette were actually two-sided, and at the last minute, the converter might flip the side and show instead of the other panel, which is much more gory, where actually the Christ is in, he would show the salvific image of the Virgin, the Madonna in the mandola, who's showing her hand and welcoming the condemned who is kneeling, and we know that he has already confessed his crime because he's bareheaded and he has the rope. So he has done the amende honorable. What's really interesting in this image is that you have on the left side the martyrdom of Saint John the Baptist, but on the right side you see this angel coming down to save Saint Catherine of Alexandria. So this is a binary image where one martyrdom leads to execution and a gory sort of image, but on the other side, Saint Catherine, so she won't be saved, but she will be, the angel will try to save her from martyrdom. So there was a hope and despair binary image in front of the face of the condemned. So on one side, the decollation of Saint John the Baptist, on the left, is really thought as a pendant to the martyrdom of Catherine of Alexandria on the right. And in the hagiography of these saints, so if you read Jacques de Voragine, for instance, it's key to understand why Catherine of Alexandria, because she was the example of heroic firmness. One factor of the promotion of this specific female saint was to really show that she was really, her eyes were raised heavenwards, looking to a golden brick in the clouds, and you see this detail of the spiked wheel by which she was to be killed, but the wheel just was destroyed by the angel who intervened in her favor. So it's an image of the heavenly bridegroom Christ and Saint Catherine, who herself, that's really important for the comforters, laid her head on the block beneath the executioner's sword. So an image of acceptation of death, which is, you can imagine how they... So it is really important to understand how the panel was used and handled, as there was a need for creating an exclusive pictorial space just for the prisoner, a space into which he was withdrawn from the world before his execution. So I've shown, so we've deframed those panels because we wanted to check whether there were some remain traces of blinkers or traces of something that would help to understand how those images were used as a dispositive. So we were able to show that it was so thin that we know of an example in Bologna where we have a handle that allows both panels to be shown on a tool that can flip. So that, I think, because they have the same size, it's the same painter, because we've analyzed very clearly the X-ray, and we've been able to sort of advance this hypothesis. And the most interesting thing so the curator was showing that is the repaints by Octave Linné. So actually this is the new state. So you see a lot of gory bloodletting details, because you have to bear in mind that in Latin you have two words for blood, cruor and sanguis. Cruor is the blood that is going to die, which is almost black. And sanguis is the blood that will bring resurrection to Christ. So there's this idea that the blood relic, you have to see the bloodletting wounds to believe that it was not cruor, but sanguis. So this piety is very visual, but also, as I said, very linked to the kissing of these images. I really want to, I could talk more about that, but the idea is to have some questions and a conversation. So what I will do is just go through, so here you have this Dürer depiction of the martyrdom of St. Catherine of Alexandria, the handling of the tavoletta, the idea that the tavoletta is a bearer of a blood relic, and the idea that blood was a dual symbol. And I'd like to conclude here. So the images I've shown today still contained a duality. So in a typical Aristotelian fashion, you have terror versus pity. But if we now compare this ancient death ritual to today's web-mediated images of the execution by ISIS, what is particularly striking is that their images are meant to display terror without pity. And the images of extreme violence disseminated by terrorist organizations are not documents. They impose a new relationship to the real, which exacerbates fears and inhibits pity, contrary to our iconographic tradition. And with the images produced by the terrorists, we know that we are not in a Hollywood film. Unfortunately, it is for real that monuments are destroyed, people are slaughtered, we are confronted with live assassinations, children playing with the heads of the decapitated, exhibitions of murderous joys, selfies, professions of faith in images before the so-called suicide attacks. Thank you. And so my point in conclusion is to say that even though those images, those tavoletta, probably for you very brutal. It's a terrific object. If you think of staging capital punishment without pity, I think it's even more extreme. And there are some philosophers who've been working on. And so that's why I wouldn't show you horrible images. I just stick to the French Mathieu Kassovitz et l'agent malotru and le Bureau des légendes as a conclusion. Because obviously, if you know the story, this is very well done because this is the end of an episode. So you don't see the execution of your beloved character. It's just the end of the season. So thanks a lot for your attention.